The courtyard was silent, but the silence did not feel peaceful. It felt watchful. Inside the private rooms of Buckingham Palace, where history breathes through carved oak and gilt-framed portraits, a single remark had just unsettled something far older than any living royal. It was not shouted. It was not even spoken in anger. It arrived softly, almost casually, draped in familiarity. And yet, those who understood the architecture of monarchy felt it immediately, because in institutions built on hierarchy, tone can wound more deeply than insult. Catherine, Princess of Wales, did not flinch. Her composure held, refined and unwavering. But beyond the polished veneer of civility, trained eyes registered the shift, the subtle tightening of posture, the fractional pause before reply, the air itself thinning between two chairs positioned according to rank. It was a small moment, so small that the world beyond the palace gates would never know it happened. But inside these walls, where precedence is not tradition but constitutional language, something had crossed an invisible line. And when invisible lines are crossed within a monarchy, the consequences rarely remain invisible for long. The courtyard was silent now, but the echo of that remark still lingered in the air. Inside a private drawing room at Buckingham Palace, the afternoon light filtered through tall windows, resting gently against silk walls and polished mahogany. The room was arranged not merely for comfort, but for order. Every chair placed with intention, every distance measured by precedence. Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood near the hearth, composed as ever. Her posture reflected something deeper than etiquette. It reflected continuity. The quiet assurance of a future queen who understood that dignity is not displayed. It is maintained. Across from her sat Tom Parker Bowles. The exchange had begun with polite civility, charitable initiatives, public engagements, the rhythm of royal duty. Nothing unusual, nothing sharp, until the tone shifted. It did not rise in volume. It lowered. "There's something to be said," he remarked lightly, "for recognizing that influence doesn't always need ceremony to justify it." The words were casual, but the suggestion beneath them was not. A footman near the doorway continued pouring tea without pause. An equerry standing discreetly by the wall kept his expression neutral. Palace staff are trained for moments like this. They do not react. They register. Catherine did not interrupt. She did not correct. She allowed the silence to settle first. "The structure exists," she replied calmly, "so that none of us must compete for place." Her voice was even, neither defensive nor dismissive. But what she defended was not herself. It was hierarchy. Tom leaned back slightly, a faint smile touching his expression. "History adapts," he said. There it was, not disagreement. Challenge, because within a monarchy, adaptation is not a casual concept. It is deliberate, controlled, measured across generations. The clock above the mantel ticked once. Then again. Catherine's gaze did not waver. "History also remembers," she answered softly. Silence followed. The conversation moved on shortly after, but something intangible had shifted. A line had been approached, perhaps crossed, not with hostility, but with familiarity. And familiarity, within royal walls, carries risk. When the meeting concluded, the door closed quietly behind Tom. The room returned to stillness. Yet stillness does not erase tension. It preserves it. An equerry stepped forward gently. "Your Royal Highness, shall the exchange be recorded?" A pause. The question was procedural, not personal. Royal households function on record, on memory, on documentation. What is not written is often forgotten. "No," Catherine replied after a measured breath. It was an informal remark. Grace, in that moment, outweighed correction. But grace does not prevent consequence. Hours later, the exchange traveled, not through gossip, but through duty. Staff who had witnessed the tone reported it with precision, stripped of emotion. Inside palace corridors, information moves quietly, not dramatically, not recklessly. By early evening, a discreet summary reached advisors affiliated with St. James's Palace. No accusation was written, only notation. Comments suggesting flexible interpretation of hierarchical distinction within institutions built on rank. Such phrasing is not minor. It signals instability. Meanwhile, at Windsor Castle, and Princess Royal concluded her final briefing of the day. She has never been governed by comfort, only by duty. A sealed advisory memorandum was placed before her. She read it once, then again. Her expression did not change, but her stillness deepened. And understand something fundamental about monarchy. It does not collapse from external pressure alone. It weakens when internal clarity softens. The issue was not insult. It was implication. If proximity to the sovereign could be interpreted as influence beyond rank, then hierarchy becomes negotiable. And hierarchy, once negotiable, becomes fragile. And stood and walked toward the window overlooking ancient stone courtyards. The crown had endured abdications, wars, public scrutiny. It endured because lines were maintained, not aggressively, but firmly. A second note arrived the following morning, a recollection from a senior aide, a quieter remark made at the edge of the conversation, more personal than political, suggesting that familiarity with the king offered natural standing. That phrase altered the matter entirely. This was no longer social informality. It was philosophical positioning. And close the file slowly. This could not remain unaddressed. Not for pride, not for discipline, but for precedent. Because if a future queen could be subtly diminished in private space, what would that imply publicly? What example would that set for the institution she is destined to uphold? Later that afternoon, and requested a private clarification meeting. Her instruction was measured, full context, witness alignment, no escalation. She did not seek confrontation. She sought reinforcement. Meanwhile, Catherine continued her public engagements with steady composure. Cameras flashed. Children laughed. Speeches were delivered with warmth and intelligence. To the world, nothing had happened. And perhaps, in personal terms, nothing had. But monarchy does not operate solely on personal terms. It operates on symbolism. And symbols, once blurred, require restoration. Inside palace walls, staff sense a shift. Not chaos, not alarm, but gravity. A subtle tightening of procedure. A return to formal phrasing. Invitations reviewed more carefully. Seating plans examined twice. No announcement was made. No public correction issued. Because some matters are resolved in silence, yet the silence itself carried weight, and reviewed archival correspondences from previous reigns. Minor missteps once dismissed had, in earlier decades, evolved into public fractures. She remembered those years. She remembered how easily perception reshapes reality. The lesson was clear. Boundaries must be defined before they are defended. As evening settled once more over palace rooftops, and placed the advisory memorandum into a leather portfolio marked for internal review. This was not a scandal. It was not rebellion. It was something quieter and potentially more consequential, a testing of space. And space within a monarchy is never undefined. The question was no longer whether a remark had been careless. The question was whether silence protected unity or permitted erosion, and understood the difference. She chose vigilance, because within institutions older than memory, even a softened tone can signal shifting ground. And what had begun as a seemingly minor exchange in a private drawing room had now entered the machinery of the crown, not loudly, but irrevocably. As informally requests clarification, an internal record surfaces, suggesting this was not the first time hierarchy had been subtly tested within palace walls. The memorandum did not feel heavier in N's hands the following morning, but the implications within it had grown. The previous evening's remark, quiet and informal, had now entered review, not as scandal, not as confrontation, but as record. And within a monarchy, record is memory. Memory is authority. Dawn settled pale and cold over St. James's Palace, where centuries of protocol are preserved not in spectacle, but in files, meticulous cross-reference, constitutional in tone, and arrived without entourage. She required none. Inside a private advisory chamber, senior household officials had assembled. The Lord Chamberlain's office, a constitutional advisor, a precedent secretary whose entire career revolved around placement, who stands where, who enters first, whose name is announced before another. To the outside world, such matters appear ornamental. Inside these walls, they are structural. A transcript reconstruction was presented, not verbatim. There had been no recording, but detailed through corroborated recollection. Tone described, timing noted, witness alignment confirmed. The first remark had questioned ceremony. The second, more discreetly delivered, had suggested that proximity to the sovereign naturally extended influence beyond formal rank, and listened without interruption. Then she asked the only question that mattered. Has precedent addressed similar positioning before? Silence followed, not from uncertainty, but from caution. An advisor opened a leather-bound archive, correspondence from prior decades. During the reign of Elizabeth II, informal boundaries had occasionally been tested by extended family members. Each time, the correction had been quiet, internal, precise, because monarchy does not rebuke publicly unless forced. It recalibrates privately. A document was placed before an advisory note written decades earlier. Its language was elegant, restrained. Familiarity must never be interpreted as equivalence of constitutional position. The phrasing was deliberate. Familiarity, equivalence, constitutional position, and close the file gently. The architecture has not changed, she said, nor has succession. The implication was clear. Modern tone does not rewrite hereditary structure. Yet the advisors hesitated, not in disagreement, but in awareness of a broader climate. The monarchy had, in recent years, adopted a softer public posture. Language simplified, access broadened, appearances less rigid, modernization. But modernization is not dilution, and that distinction now required clarity. Meanwhile, across London, Catherine continued her scheduled engagements. A visit to an early childhood initiative, conversations with educators, the warmth of cameras and applause. Her composure was unchanged. If she carried awareness of the internal review unfolding elsewhere, she did not reveal it. Grace remained her shield, back inside St. James's Palace, and requested expanded context. Was there hesitation in response? She asked. The equerry present during the exchange responded carefully. Your Royal Highness remained entirely composed. And nodded once. That mattered, because dignity under challenge strengthens authority more than reaction ever could. But what troubled her was not Catherine's strength. It was the creeping suggestion that rank could be interpreted fluidly. Titles within a monarchy are not decorative flourishes. They are constitutional indicators. They determine not only seating arrangements, but state responsibility, regency provisions, representation and absence. Blur the hierarchy privately, and it becomes negotiable publicly. An advisor cleared his throat gently. There have been recent instances, he admitted, of extended familial presence within semi-formal environments. The lines have softened, and consider the word. Softening can appear harmless, even humane. But institutions do not survive on sentiment. They survive on clarity. She rose and walked toward the tall window overlooking the courtyard. Guards changed position below with exact, synchronized steps. Ceremony embodied. The public sees unity, and said quietly, they must never see uncertainty. The room understood. This was not about punishment. It was about reinforcement. The advisors presented seating precedents for future engagements. Adjustments would be made subtly, placement reaffirmed. Invitations recalibrated. Informal access reduced without spectacle. Correction without humiliation. That is the monarchy's preferred instrument. But then a final detail emerged. The secondary remark, suggesting natural standing through closeness to the king, had been delivered in lower tone, beyond the primary conversational circle. It had been overheard by a senior aide known for precision. That altered the dynamic, because a private aside reveals truer belief than a public comment, and returned to her seat. Was it corrected in the moment? No, ma'am. And was it challenged afterward? No formal objection was made. Catherine's silence again. Noble, but silence, while gracious, can be misinterpreted. The advisors waited for instruction and did not rush. She understood that within a family, correction carries emotional consequence. Camilla's position as queen consort and mother complicated the reign. Blood and duty intersect uneasily. Yet, monarchy demands prioritization. Arrange a clarification, and said at last, Private, direct. No memorandum circulated beyond the necessary offices. No wider household alert. This will remain contained. But containment does not mean minimization. As the meeting adjourned and remained seated alone for a moment longer, her mind drifted briefly, not sentimentally, but analytically, to past decades. She had witnessed how minor oversights accumulated, how unchecked familiarity gradually eroded deference, how the public, observing small gestures, reshaped narratives. Institutions rarely fall from dramatic assault. They weaken from incremental reinterpretation. Outside, London moved in its usual rhythm. Buses crossed bridges. Tourists gathered near palace gates. The monarchy appeared unchanged. Yet inside advisory rooms and archival corridors, something deliberate was unfolding, not reaction, restoration. Later that afternoon, and placed a direct call to request a private audience. No accusation in her tone. No emotional inflection. Only clarity. Because the matter was no longer about a drawing room remark. It was about structure. The cost of familiarity is rarely immediate. It accumulates. And titles, though spoken lightly by some, carry the weight of centuries. As evening approached, the internal review expanded quietly. Guest lists for upcoming events were reconsidered. Formal introductions reinstated where recent months had favored informality. Advisory language drafted, not punitive but precise. Within the palace, correction moves like shadow. Invisible, effective. Catherine concluded her final engagement of the day beneath soft flashes of cameras. Her smile steady, her posture unwavering. If she sensed a recalibration taking place behind the scenes, she gave no sign, because strength within monarchy often means allowing others to defend what you refuse to defend for yourself. Night settled again across royal residences and reviewed the advisory draft prepared by the Lord Chamberlain's office. Its wording was impeccable. Recent informal exchanges have prompted a reaffirmation of established precedence distinctions to ensure clarity of constitutional roles. No names, no incidents, only principle. She approved the framework, but not its release. Not yet. First, there will be a conversation, face to face, because before structure is reinforced on paper, it must be acknowledged in person, and close the portfolio slowly. The issue had moved beyond social discomfort. It had entered institutional memory, and once memory records something, it cannot simply be ignored. Familiarity had approached equivalence. Equivalence had been implied. Now hierarchy would respond, calmly, decisively, without spectacle, as arrangements are made for a private clarification, and prepares to confront not merely a remark, but a mindset, knowing that the next conversation may determine whether respect is restored or quietly renegotiated. The advisory draft remained unsigned when, and departed for London. Clarity, she believed, must precede documentation. By late afternoon, the gates of Clarence House opened without ceremony. No press, no public schedule, only a private meeting arranged with deliberate discretion. Inside, the atmosphere felt warm, domestic even. Framed photographs, softer lighting, suggestion of family rather than institution. And did not arrive as family. She arrived as guardian of structure. Tom Parker Bowles was already waiting when she entered the drawing room. He stood promptly, offering polite acknowledgement. "Your Royal Highness." "Thank you for agreeing to speak," and replied. Her tone was even, unadorned. They sat opposite one another, distance measured not by furniture, but by purpose. There were no aides present, no recorders. Only memory would carry what was said here, and began without preamble. A recent exchange at Buckingham Palace has been formally reviewed. Tom's expression shifted, not defensive but alert. It was an informal conversation, he said carefully. Informality, and replied, does not exempt implication. Silence settled between them. Outside the tall windows, London traffic hummed faintly, a distant siren. The world continued unaware that within these walls, hierarchy itself was under discussion. Tom exhaled slowly. "If this concerns my remarks about adaptation," he said, "I spoke generally. The monarchy evolves. It always has." And did not dispute evolution. She disputed equivalence. "Evolution," she answered, occurs through sovereign decision, not casual suggestion. Her gaze held steady. You implied that proximity confers standing beyond constitutional rank. Tom leaned forward slightly. With respect, proximity does confer influence. Family dynamics are real. Modern audiences understand that. There's a distinction, and said calmly, between private counsel and public standing. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. Influence is not the same as authority. The words lingered. Tom's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I did not challenge Catherine personally. No, and agreed. You challenged structure. That struck closer. He leaned back again, composure returning. I meant no erosion of respect. Intent, and said, is not the sole measure of consequence. The room grew very still, because this was no longer about tone. It was about philosophy, and continued. The Princess of Wales carries constitutional destiny. Every gesture toward her position reinforces or weakens public perception of continuity. Tom remained silent. You suggested that ceremony is excess, and went on, ceremony is not decoration. It is reassurance. The words were deliberate. For generations, ceremony has communicated stability when politics falters. It has embodied continuity when governments change. To diminish ceremony is to risk misreading its purpose. Tom's expression softened slightly. I spoke from familiarity, he admitted, and familiarity, and replied, must know its boundary. A pause followed. Not hostile, measured. Then Tom asked a question quietly. Is this an official reprimand? No, and said immediately, it is a clarification. Relief flickered briefly, but only briefly. Clarification of what? He asked. Of place. The word carried centuries, and folded her hands lightly in her lap. You are respected as family, she said. But respect within family does not translate to constitutional parallel. Tom absorbed this without interruption. You may offer private counsel to your mother, and continued. You may hold influence within personal conversation, but suggestion of standing beyond ceremonial hierarchy introduces ambiguity. He looked toward the window for a moment, and if the public already assumes influence, he asked, then our duty, and answered, is to remove assumption, not affirm it. The firmness in her tone was unmistakable, because monarchy survives not by surrendering perception, but by guiding it. For a moment, neither spoke. The ticking of a nearby clock filled the space, steady, unhurried. Then Tom's voice lowered. I never intended to diminish Catherine, and studied him carefully. I believe that, she said, but belief does not negate impact. He nodded once, slowly. And what would you have me do? The question was direct, not defiant, and his reply came without hesitation. Respect distance. It was not punishment. It was instruction. Publicly and privately, she continued. Reinforce precedence through conduct. Allow no suggestion, spoken or implied, that proximity equates to authority. Tom exhaled, understood, but, and was not finished. There is another matter, she said. His expression tightened again. A secondary remark was noted. He did not ask what it was. He remembered, and allowed the silence to encourage honesty. I spoke carelessly, he admitted at last. Yes, she replied quietly. There was no accusation in her tone, only conclusion. At that moment, a subtle shift occurred, not of tension, but of understanding, because acknowledgement restores what argument cannot. Tom straightened slightly. I will ensure there is no repetition. And inclined her head. That is sufficient. The confrontation had not been dramatic. There had been no raised voices, no threats, no declarations, only clarity. But clarity in monarchy carries power. As Anne rose to leave, she paused briefly. One more consideration, she said. Tom waited. The princess chose not to escalate this matter. That revelation altered the room entirely. She declined formal notation. Tom looked genuinely surprised. She did not wish division. The weight of that choice settled heavily, because Catherine's silence had not been weakness. It had been unity, and held his gaze. Grace should not be mistaken for acquiescence. He nodded. I understand. Whether he fully did or would remain to be seen, and departed without further ceremony. Outside, the gates of Clarence's house closed softly behind her vehicle. The confrontation had achieved its purpose, not punishment, not humiliation, but boundary. Yet as the car moved through London streets, and knew something deeper lingered. This was not merely about one exchange. It was about a shifting cultural instinct, an appetite for informality, for blurred distinction, for equality of voice within hereditary systems. Modernity presses gently but persistently, and monarchy must decide where to yield and where to remain immovable. Meanwhile, inside Clarence's house, Tom remained seated long after Anne's departure. Her words replayed, not harsh but immovable. Respect distance. Allow no ambiguity. Grace is not acquiescence. For the first time since the drawing room exchange, the full scope of implications settled in. This had not been a family disagreement. It had been constitutional correction. Elsewhere, Catherine concluded another engagement with quiet composure. Cameras flashed. Applause followed. No one beyond palace walls sensed the recalibration taking place behind closed doors. And yet, beneath the visible grace of public life, the monarchy had just reinforced its internal spine. Later that evening, and informed the Lord Chamberlain's office that the clarification had occurred. Documentation unnecessary at this stage, she instructed. Correction achieved privately remains more powerful than correction displayed. But vigilance would continue, because structure once tested invites future testing. And though this confrontation had resolved the immediate concern, the underlying tension between blood and duty remained delicately balanced. And understood this well. The monarchy is not sustained by affection alone. It is sustained by disciplined respect. And sometimes, the strongest offense of unity is the quiet refusal to let hierarchy blur. As in returns to Windsor, a separate awareness begins to stir. Because within palace walls, another voice has learned of the exchange, and Camilla now faces a decision that tests the line between motherhood and monarchy. The confrontation had ended without spectacle, but its echo lingered. At Windsor Castle, the corridors felt longer that evening. The ancient stone absorbed sound the way it absorbed history, quietly without display, and moved through the private apartments with the composure of someone who understood that resolution is rarely final. Correction had been delivered, boundaries clarified, yet something deeper had surfaced. Not rebellion, not hostility, but erosion's earliest whisper. She paused in a gallery lined with portraits of sovereigns past, figures who had endured scandal, war, abdication. Each expression preserved an oil unchanging. What had threatened them had rarely been loud at first. It had been subtle, a suggestion here, a concession there, and remembered decades earlier, moments when minor slights had been dismissed in the name of unity. Some had remained harmless. Others had grown roots. Institutions, she knew, do not fracture overnight. They weaken through gradual reinterpretation. Outside, the evening sky darkened above the castle towers. Within another royal residence, Camilla had received word of the meeting. Inside her private sitting room, the atmosphere felt different, not defensive, not alarmed, but reflective. She had not been present during the original exchange, nor during Anne's clarification. Yet she understood instinctively that the matter had moved beyond family conversation. Motherhood and monarchy do not share equal footing. And tonight, those roles stood in quiet tension. Camilla sat alone for some time before speaking with any advisor. The weight she carried was not public. It was internal. She loved her son. That truth was immovable. But love within monarchy is often secondary to continuity. When an aide gently summarized Anne's position, Camilla did not interrupt. She did not dispute the necessity of clarity. Instead, she asked only one question. Was Catherine distressed? The answer came calmly. No, Your Majesty. She remained entirely composed. Camilla closed her eyes briefly, not in relief, but in recognition. Catherine's composure had once again protected unity, and that protection now required reinforcement. Across London, Catherine prepared briefing notes for the following week's engagements. Her routine had not changed. She neither sought apology nor acknowledgement. Her silence had been intentional, not passive. She understood that public fracture serves no one. But silence also leaves space, and space must be guarded carefully. Meanwhile, in a quiet chamber at Windsor, and reviewed additional documents retrieved from archival correspondence. There had, indeed, been prior advisories, subtle reminders issued years earlier regarding blurred familiarity between extended family and formal rank. None had escalated. None had required public correction. Yet patterns matter, and trace the language carefully. Clarity of distinction ensures confidence of succession. Confidence of succession. That phrase lingered. Monarchy depends on predictability, on visible order, on the understanding that roles are defined long before they are occupied. If suggestion of equivalence entered private discourse unchecked, perception might follow, and perception shapes loyalty. Hours later, and Camilla spoke privately. No advisors present, no documentation. The conversation was neither accusatory nor defensive. It was measured. I addressed the matter directly and stated, Camilla inclined her head. I understand. A pause settled between them. Then Camilla spoke with quiet firmness. He meant no harm. I believe that, and replied, but intent is not architecture. Camilla absorbed the distinction. She knew, perhaps better than anyone, what it meant to exist adjacent to structure rather than within it. Her own path to queenship had required endurance. Years of scrutiny, of contested perception. She understood the cost of blurred lines. I will speak with him, she said softly, and studied her sister-in-law carefully. This is not about correction through rebuke, and said, it is about reinforcing distance. Camilla nodded, and about Catherine, she added quietly. The name hung in the room with quiet weight. Catherine's role was not ornamental. It was foundational to the monarchy's future. Public confidence in her position must remain unshaken, particularly in moments unseen. She chose silence and said, Camilla's expression shifted. She always does. Not criticism, observation. And in that observation lay understanding, because Catherine's restraint had prevented escalation. But restraint must not become expectation. The two women sat in silence for a moment longer. Outside, the wind moved gently across the castle grounds. Guards changed posts with mechanical precision. Ceremony continued, and within that ceremony, the monarchy reaffirmed itself, not through declaration, but through discipline. Elsewhere, Tom reflected alone, and words had not accused him. They had framed him, not as adversary, but as variable. And variables within monarchy are stabilized through choice. He understood now that familiarity inside royal walls carries symbolic consequence. What feels natural in private may resonate structurally in public. The distinction had become clear. Back at Windsor, and finalize her internal assessment. No public statement would be issued. No advisory released beyond necessary offices. Instead, subtle recalibrations would take place. Future seating plans would emphasize rank more visibly. Informal access to semi-formal spaces would be reduced. Invitations adjusted, not withdrawn, but clarified. Correction through structure. Note spictac. As night deepened, Catherine stood briefly at a palace window, overlooking gardens illuminated by soft lamplight. She did not dwell on the exchange. She understood that her strength lies not in confrontation, but in consistency. Yet somewhere in the quiet rhythm of the evening, she knew that lines had been redrawn, not dramatically, but deliberately. The monarchy had shifted, not outwardly, but internally. Boundaries reinforced, expectations reset. And beneath it all, an unspoken truth lingered. Family may share blood, but the crown shares responsibility. As an extinguished the final lamp in her study, she understood that vigilance must remain constant, because while this matter had been contained, it revealed something enduring. Modern instinct favors closeness. Monarchy requires distance. Balance must be guarded. And when distance narrows too casually, someone must widen again, not harshly, but firmly. The castle settled into silence. Yet beneath that silence, the institution recalibrated its invisible framework, strengthened not by confrontation, but by clarity. At dawn, a private council will convene, attendance limited, agenda undisclosed, Marking the moment, this quiet correction becomes formal structure within the crown's inner circle. The dawn arrived without ceremony. Mist settled low across the ground of Windsor Castle, softening the ancient stone in pale light. From a distance, nothing appeared altered. Guards rotated posts with practiced precision. Staff moved through corridors with quiet efficiency. But within a private council chamber, structure was being reaffirmed. Attendance was limited. The Lord Chamberlain, a senior constitutional advisor, the private secretary, and Princess Royal, and, seated with measured composure, Camilla, Queen of the United Kingdom. No press would ever report this gathering. No minutes would be released beyond restricted record. Yet what unfolded within those walls would fortify something unseen and open the session without preface. The matter has been clarified privately, she stated. Acknowledgement has been secured. No name was spoken. It did not need to be. The advisor nodded and presented a document drafted the previous evening. Its language was precise, elegant in its restraint. Recent informal exchanges have prompted reaffirmation of established precedents and constitutional distinction within all semi-formal and private royal environments. No accusation, no reprimand, only principle. Camilla read the wording carefully. Her expression did not betray conflict, but it held awareness. The balance she carried was delicate. Motherhood does not dissolve upon coronation, yet sovereignty demands hierarchy. She lifted her gaze. This is necessary, she said quietly. The acknowledgement carried weight, because in that moment, blood yielded to duty. The document outlined procedural refinements, subtle but unmistakable. Future engagements would re-emphasize order of entry. Introductions within private receptions would follow formal announcement protocol. Seating arrangements would reflect constitutional position without exception. Distance restored through choreography. Correction embedded in ritual, and observed without triumph. There was no victory here, only preservation. The advisor continued. These measures will not be publicized. They will be implemented through scheduling, briefing, and placement guidance. Exactly as monarchy prefers. Stability without spectacle. Silence followed as the document was signed, not as decree, but as internal directive. Camilla placed her signature with steady hand. In doing so, she affirmed something larger than maternal instinct. She affirmed the crown. Hours later, across London, Catherine prepared for a diplomatic reception at Buckingham Palace. The palace shimmered beneath clear morning light, flags lifted gently in the breeze. She had not requested intervention. She had not sought explanation. Yet as she entered the reception hall that evening, something subtle had shifted. Introductions were formally announced. Distances measured precisely. Order unmistakable. It was not theatrical. It was intentional. Tom arrived later among invited guests. His posture carried new awareness. When introduced, he inclined his head deeply. Not merely polite, but deliberate. Your Royal Highness. The phrasing held clarity. No familiarity beyond boundary. Catherine responded with warmth, neither distant nor indulgent. Grace returned, reinforced. From across the hall, and observed the exchange quietly. There was no need for prolonged attention. The structure spoke for itself. Later, in a smaller adjoining room, Camilla and Catherine shared a brief private moment. No mention of the memorandum. No reference to correction. But Camilla's words carried quiet affirmation. You carry yourself with remarkable steadiness, she said. Catherine met her gaze with sincerity. Stability serves us all. A simple exchange. Yet, within it lived mutual understanding. Because monarchy is sustained not only by rules, but by restraint. As the evening progressed, conversation flowed. Diplomats moved through gilded corridors. Laughter echoed beneath chandeliers. To the world, it was another seamless display of royal continuity. No fracture visible. No tension apparent. But beneath the visible elegance, the invisible scaffolding had been reinforced and departed before the reception concluded. She preferred not to linger in celebration. Outside, the night air was cool against ancient stone. She paused briefly in the courtyard, listening to the measured echo of her own footsteps. This had never been about silencing a voice. It had been about preserving a framework. Blood ties, though powerful, cannot supersede constitutional alignment. That truth is neither cold nor unkind. It is necessary. Meanwhile, Tom reflected on the evening's choreography. The re-established formalities were unmistakable. Not humiliating, clarifying. He understood now that access carries responsibility, that influence must remain private if it is to avoid distorting perception. The correction had not diminished him. It had defined him. Back within the palace walls, advisors reviewed the event quietly. No deviation, no ambiguity. Structure restored. In Windsor, and filed the final advisory into restricted archive. The matter would not reemerge unless required. That is a monarchy's discipline. Resolution without spectacle. Camilla, alone later in her private apartments, allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. She had chosen correctly, not as mother, as queen, and in doing so, she ensured that Catherine's path toward queenship remained unobstructed by ambiguity. Because monarchy is not sustained by affection alone, it is sustained by order. As midnight approached, the palace lights dimmed gradually. The institution resumed its steady rhythm, unchanged outwardly, strengthened inwardly. No press release would ever recount the sequence. No historian may ever footnote it. Yet within the private memory of the crown, a boundary had been tested and restored, and understood that vigilance does not end with correction. It continues quietly, constantly, because the greatest threat to continuity is not rebellion. It is erosion, and erosion is defeated not by noise, but by resolve. As the palace settles back into measured calm and pauses before departure, aware that today's vigilance safeguarded more than protocol, it safeguarded legacy. The palace had returned to rhythm. Footsteps echoed in measured cadence across polished floors. Carriages arrived and departed beneath discreet security. Flags rose and lowered according to schedule. To the public eye, the monarchy remained seamless, unbroken, undisturbed. And yet, within its quiet machinery, something essential had been reinforced. At Windsor Castle, the morning air carried a stillness that felt earned. The previous days had not brought scandal, nor confrontation visible to the world. There had been no headlines, no public correction, only silence, but not the silence of avoidance, the silence of guardianship, and stood briefly along the castle terrace, overlooking ground shaped by centuries of continuity. Her role had never required applause. It required endurance. The matter had been contained, not suppressed, but clarified, and clarity, when delivered without spectacle, preserves dignity on all sides. That was a lesson. Elsewhere at Buckingham Palace, Catherine reviewed briefing papers for an upcoming state engagement. Her days continued without alteration. Public warmth, measured speeches, poised beneath scrutiny. She had never demanded redress. She had not needed to. Her authority did not rely on rebuttal. It relied on consistency. And consistency over time becomes unshakable. Camilla, too, moved through her duties with composed assurance. Charity visits, meetings, correspondence, outwardly unchanged. Yet, privately, she carried a deeper awareness. The crown is not inherited only through blood. It is inherited through responsibility. And responsibility sometimes requires discomfort. Her choice had not been between son and sister-in-law. It had been between instinct and institution. She had chosen the institution. That decision would not be publicly acknowledged, but it would be remembered, because monarchy survives not through perfection, but through correction. In the days that followed, subtle recalibrations became habit. Introductions restored their full formal cadence. Seating plans adhered strictly to rank. Invitations were extended with precise language. No one remarked upon it openly, but everyone understood. Distance had been re-established, and with distance came clarity. Tom, reflecting quietly, adjusted his posture within the royal sphere. Familiarity no longer blurred distinction. His presence remained welcome, but measured. The correction had not diminished affection. It had defined it. He understood now that influence, when implied too broadly, threatens the very structure that grants proximity its meaning. Across the institution, aides resumed routine with renewed attentiveness. Files were closed, memoranda archived, advisory draft sealed. The machinery of monarchy moved forward, precise, disciplined, unpublicized, and knew that this was how it must be. Monarchy does not thrive on confrontation. It thrives on restraint. She paused one evening in a quiet corridor lined with portraits, sovereigns whose reigns had endured turbulence far greater than informal remarks. Each face bore the same unspoken truth. Legacy is not preserved by emotion. It is preserved by boundary. The exchange in that private drawing room had been small, almost forgettable. Yet within monarchy, symbols are never small. A tone can shift perception. A suggestion can reshape assumption. An assumption, left unchecked, can erode authority. That erosion had been halted, not with punishment, but with principle. Catherine's silence had safeguarded unity. Camilla's acknowledgement had affirmed structure. Anne's firmness had reinforced distance. 3 distinct responses. 1 shared outcome. Stability. Because the crown does not defend itself loudly. It is defended by those willing to accept discomfort in its name. As evening descended once more across palace rooftops, the lights within ancient windows glowed softly against darkened sky. Tourists gathered beyond gates, cameras raised, unaware of the quiet vigilance that sustains the spectacle they admire. Inside, life continued. Briefings prepared, ceremonies rehearsed, duties fulfilled. And beneath it all, an invisible understanding endured. Family may gather around a sovereign, but only hierarchy sustains a monarchy. Silence, when chosen deliberately, is not weakness. It is strength restrained, and understood that future tests would come. They always do. Modernity presses persistently against tradition, urging informality, proximity, equality of voice. Some evolution is necessary, some softness humane, but the core must remain immovable, because if every line softens, none remain, and monarchy without line becomes pageantry without anchor. The echo of that original remark had faded, not because it was forgotten, but because it had been addressed. Quietly, precisely, decisively, the institution endured, stronger not for having avoided conflict, but for having resolved it without spectacle, and turned from the terrace and walked back into the castle's interior, footsteps measured, posture unbent. There would be other moments, other whispers, other subtle tests of distance and definition. But this one had affirmed something essential. The crown endures because someone, somewhere within its walls, refuses to let standards quietly erode. And in that refusal lies its future. And tomorrow, another quiet challenge will rise within palace walls, proving once again that history listens closely even to the softest of whispers.